Alright folks, this is plate tectonics, and I wanted to start off here with just kind of a history of plate tectonics, right? So just to remind you, I know we talked about this in the first chapter, but let's bring it back again. Our Earth built up from the center, we got the inner core. The outer core, the only part of our Earth that is truly a liquid, right? Mantle, which is solid, and then the crust, which is also solid, right? Now these are the compositional layers, right? When we're talking plate tectonics, it's really the structural layers that are a lot more important. Then starts off the same from the center of the inner core, the outer core, but then we take the mantle and the crust and break them up into three parts. We have the mesosphere, the lower part of the mantle, not really involved in plate tectonics. And then the two layers that are really incredibly important to plate tectonics, the asthenosphere, that's that upper part, that partially molten, plasticky layer that acts as that buoyant surface. Right? And then we have the lithosphere, which is made up of the crust, plus a little bit of the uppermost mantle that is stuck to it, right? And those move together as a rigid body in the process of plate tectonics, right? So let's take a look here at some features around our Earth's surface, right? We have, some fracture zones in our oceans, right? We have linear island chains like Hawaii, deep ocean trenches in some parts of our Earth, mid-ocean ridges running kind of like the seams and stitching of a baseball across our globe, right? We have continents, of course. We have some submerged ridges, island arcs, continental shelves in some areas, but not everywhere, right? High plateaus like the Himalayas, and mountain chains, right? Now let's observe where some earthquakes are located around our planet, right? These are just some of our earthquakes, right? We have earthquakes that appear in belts, right? Up by our Aleutian Islands, along mid-ocean ridges, along trenches next to and in trenches, in mountain belts. Some regions are noticeably very sparse in earthquake activity. We have southern Eurasia right in the Himalayas. Now let's check out these volcanoes. Wait a minute, earthquakes, volcanoes, earthquakes, volcanoes. Are you getting the idea? They might be related somehow, right? Well, let's take a look. Earthquake or volcanoes in belts, right? Our Aleutian Islands, those are volcanic islands. Mid-ocean ridges, not all of these are shown, but we do have lots of volcanic activity along mid-ocean ridges. In islands, right, like Hawaii. Mountain belts next to these trenches. The Red Sea in East Africa. Interesting place there. Sparse in some regions, noticeably the same regions that earthquakes tend to be sparse in. They're in island arcs next to trenches as well. Right. So, this leads us to the idea that maybe volcanoes, the locations of volcanoes and earthquakes are related somehow, right? And the way we use to explain their relationship now is the modern theory of plate tectonics. But this incorporates actually three kind of previous theories. One known as continental drift. A second, mantle convection, the idea that the mantle of our Earth, that asthenosphere, is convecting kind of like a pot of boiling water, right? And then seafloor spreading as well. We'll look at each of these individually here. But let's look at continental drift. This was proposed by a gentleman named Alfred Wegener back in 1915, so a while ago, right? And his idea was that at one time, all of the continents were once together in a large supercontinent called the supercontinent Pangaea, and had a bunch of evidence to kind of support this, right? So here's the Pangaea, right? And his idea of continental drift is that the supercontinent Pangaea started to break apart some 200 million years ago, and since then the continents have been drifting to their present locations, therefore continental drift, right? So, again, those continents, the idea is they have since then drifted to their present positions, right? He did have quite a bit of evidence in support of continental drift, including the fit of the continents. Darn it all if they don't just look like puzzle pieces, right? He had a bunch of fossil evidence that he used. Rock types and structural similarities that he could match across ocean basins. and paleoclimatic evidence as well in the form of glacial evidence. Look at these kind of individually here. So very noticeably, right, this kind of corner in Brazil matches this indent, right, in Africa very well as this curve out along the African coast and the curve in along our North American coast tend to, I mean, that's very suspicious, isn't it, right? So as we look at these, right, these outer boundaries of where these continents were at one time would have been continental shelves, right? We're building up thicker continental shelves there, right? And then there's overlap in the middle where you can find stream deposits that are found both on Africa and South America. If you push those two back together, guess what? They match up pretty well, right? He also had a bunch of fossil evidence, these little dude mesosaurs, a Permian freshwater reptile found in South America and Africa, right? Now, how does a freshwater reptile swim across a saltwater ocean, right? Well, they couldn't, right? So this suggests that they were together. But if you don't believe me, right, here's a bunch of other ones that were found on various continents as well. The Signathus, right, on South America and Africa. Here's our mesosaur buddy. These leaves called Glossopteris, right, found on South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. And that's a pretty hard one to explain if the continents are where they have always been. Right? In other words, if there is no continental drift. And these Lystrosaur guys, again, Antarctica, India, and Africa. Quite a bit of connections between there. Just land animals, plants, and aquatic animals that it's hard to explain these, if the continents are where they always have been, right? But when we push them back into Pangea, oh, now look, it's just, species ranges, right? Structural similarities as well, before continental drift came along, the idea, the way, a lot of geologists had is that, there must have been huge mountain ranges that went across the oceans and have since been worn down, right? Of course, there's no evidence for that. I mean, this kind of looks like that could have been, right? But, looking at the mountains, the Caledonia Mountains, the British Isles, and the Appalachians here in the United States, right, we notice that the rock types, the ages, the structures are all very similar, right? So this means maybe there were mountains, that have been worn away, but we have no evidence of those worn away mountains, right? But if we push them back together in Pangea, look, it's just one mountain range that has been ripped apart by continental drift. And then paleoclimatic evidence in the form of glacial striations, right? So here's a scratched rock up here is a glacier, these huge continental glaciers, a mile thick or more of ice that was on top of us here about, 20,000 years ago or so. But, there have been other glaciation events in the past, right? And one of them that we've seen some ancient glacial evidence for is, it looks like, that we find evidence in South America, Africa, India, and Australia that looks like the glaciers, these continental big land glaciers or ice sheets, were starting in the oceans and then crawling up onto land. Now, glaciers flow via gravity. So is that the way glaciers flow? No, it's not, right? So again, these glacial grooves indicate that they must have moved from what is, now sea onto land. But if we put them back together in Pangea, now look, it's just an ice sheet emanating from the South Pole, right? So that makes quite a bit of sense. So obviously, Alfred Wegener was hailed as the hero of continental of plate geology, right? Came up with the theory. No, actually, he was almost laughed out of science, right? Booed out of science. Nobody really believed him. All this evidence, right? And but the real big problem was he never provided a mechanism, a how, a why these continents could be moving, right? And then in the year of 1930, he was in Greenland, got stuck in a blizzard and died trying to find evidence to support his theory. So, we really did kill poor Alfred, right? In that same year, he didn't live to see it, but the same year, gentleman Arthur Holmes suggests this idea of thermal convection, right? And the mantle as the driving force. This is the idea that, just like in a pot of water, it heats up at the bottom, right? Rises because that's less dense. As it cools down, it becomes denser and it falls, right? These convection cycles, right? This is the idea of mantle convection, right? Just got to play this for you here, folks. Whoops. A little song to remind you about Alfred Wegener. Whoops. Let's do that again.
In the year of 1910, there was a scientist whose name was Alfred Wegener. He noticed that the continents looked just like pieces of a broken puzzle. By 1915, he called it continental drift. It caused a rift with his fellow scientists who sang, "Ha ha, Alfred Wegener, you are a crazy man. Ha ha, Alfred Wegener, you are a crazy little man." They reminded him he had no proof for how or why the continents could do this. And until you show just how or why, you merely have one interesting hypothesis. Until this evidence we see, you don't have a theory. Ha ha, Alfred Wegener, you are a crazy man. Ha ha, Alfred Wegener, you are a crazy little man. In the year of 1930, on an expedition to Greenland, Wegener got caught in a blizzard. When they finally found him, it was much too late, and they buried him in an icy mausoleum. 30 years after he died, a new idea came to light. It changed the way geologists saw the world and brought continental drift back to life. Now everybody sings, "Yeehaw, Alfred Wegener, you are a brilliant man. Yeehaw, Alfred Wegener, you are a brilliant, brilliant man." Continental drift, Alfred Wegener's theory, continental drift. Alfred Wegener's theory, continental drift. Alfred Wegener's theory, continental drift. Alfred Wegener's brilliant theory.
All right, that was fun there, right? So let's take a look at this idea of mantle convection, right? As you go deeper in our Earth, you get hotter and hotter, warmer and warmer, right? So idea that these convection currents, right, as they kind of come together and rise, right, and move things apart, they act maybe kind of as a giant conveyor belt that starts to move these lithospheric plates apart from each other, where those convection cycles, right, go apart from each other, right? Maybe that's where we get our ridges and our separation, right? On the other end of things, right, we have the continents moving together. So if we look down in this area here, right, we have two convection cycles coming together, right, now pushing these plates together. That's where we get a convergent style of margin, a coming together, right? This is the idea of mantle convection, right? Show you this little video here. Here's a good little view of mantle convection. Looking down on our Earth.
But the huge molten core contributes something else essential for life on Earth. A way of helping to regulate the planet's temperature. It's a remarkable system. Magma heated by the core rises towards the Earth's surface. As it spreads sideways, the Earth's crust is very slowly dragged apart. This moves the continents, creating the Earth's restless and ever-changing surface.
Alright. Just to get an idea of mantle convection there. Alright. Now, the next theory that's
Enjoy
incorporated...
this movie, then visit
Whoops.
brainpop.com for much more.
Alright. Okay, let's go back to it. Come on. Almost there. There we go. Alright. So then the next theory wrapped up into plate tectonics is seafloor spreading, right? So in World War II, we were really interested in mapping the ocean floor. Why do you think that would be? Well, submarine technology became huge, right? So we wanted to figure out, where, German subs might be hiding, or where, we might find a good place to hide, right? For underwater warfare. But during this, there's their sonic and their sonar investigations of the seafloor. They discovered for the first time these deep, long, crack-like rifts running and extending across our globe, right? And then smaller little fractures that emanate from the side, so it really ends up looking like the stitching or the seams and then the stitching on a baseball, right? So finally, in the 1960s, this was all kind of put together. Harry Hess and Robert Dietz kind of independently concluded that these rifts, right, these mid-ocean ridges, this is where ocean floor is separating, right? We're creating basically new crust, new oceanic crust when that separates, right? So when it gets pulled apart, you can't just leave a big hole in the earth. Something's going to fill it in. What's going to fill it in? Magma from the asthenosphere, right? And that's going to be very iron and magnesium rich, and it's going to create new seafloor, new oceanic seafloor, right? So throwing this all together now, right? Alfred Wegener is, now hailed as, one of the big heroes of geology, right? But, so putting together his theory of continental drift, right? Mantle convection and seafloor spreading, that gets us to our modern theory of plate tectonics. All right? See you in the next video, folks.